Welcome, everyone. Welcome to this lovely church, this beautiful 13th century church. And I'd like to say a big thank you to Dave, who's been playing the organ for you for the last half an hour or so. Well done, Dave. And give him a clap. Yeah. Give him a clap. The last talk I gave, which was this time last year, covered Doddinghurst's history up to the end of the 16th century, when the Doddinghurst diarist, Richard Stoneleigh, acquired the land from the 17th Earl of Oxford, Edward de Vere, whose enormous debts had forced him to sell. Now we move forward over 200 years to Victorian times. Queen Victoria, as you know, reigned for over 60 years, between 1837 and 1901, and conveniently for those studying that era, the first full census took place in 1841. Studying those Victorian censuses of Doddinghurst parish was an intriguing and surprisingly addictive activity. There were so many particulars that caught my eye and helped me create a picture of our village in the 19th century. I also looked at maps and newspaper articles from that time, and these were even more compelling. So what is to follow is a sort of smorgasbord of interesting facts and riveting stories. First of all, what constituted the parish of Doddinghurst? It was a very rural parish, the boundaries of which changed quite recently, only 30 years ago. This change is significant because the area of the parish that moved into the parish of Kelvedon Hatch only in 1987 was in the 19th century the most populous part of Doddinghurst parish. So let's have a look at the boundary changes of 1987. You can see the full picture there. That chunk, which is clearly marked, is the bit that moved out of Doddinghurst parish into Kelvedon Hatch parish. This plan shows quite clearly how the chunk round Fox Hatch was transferred to Kelvedon Hatch in order to even up the populations after the huge amount of development in Doddinghurst after the Second World War. The other map is even more detailed and allows us to see the changes more clearly. If we start at the point opposite the Eagle pub, I'm sure many of you know the Eagle pub, where the old police office was, you can see that the area known as Fox Hatch, bordered by the pathway parallel with Eagle Lane and School Road, down towards Blackmore Road, down Place Farm Lane, down along Church Lane, round Warren Lane, past Cow's Farm and Cow Farm. Are you still with me? Good, good. Down Frog Street, then back up the pathway towards Eagle Lane, used to belong to the parish of Doddinghurst, but is now in the parish of Kelvedon Hatch. So, of course, if we're studying Victorian times, we have to consider that part as well. And I'll be telling you more about the history of that area in another talk in April. Something to look forward to, yes? So getting back to Victorian times, I have studied the tithe map of Doddinghurst made in 1846, which is in the Essex Record Office and is 6 feet long. It shows every building and every field and who owned everything. A fascinating, worth a visit to the Essex Record Office just to see it. I've endeavoured to make a very simple plan from it, enhanced by Bill. It's not 100% accurate, certainly not in the shape and comparative size of the buildings, but it does show and it names the farms that dominated the parish then. So let's look at the demographics of the 19th century. The map on the screen shows you where the buildings were in the 19th century. The large ones were the farms, all surrounded by clusters of barns and labourers' dwellings. Let's start with Deal Tree Farm, number 1, which is next to the health centre. Then work our way down Outings Lane, past Barfield Farm, number 2, which is a Grade 2 listed building. In some censuses, it's called Ortons or Outons Farm, which of course explains why it's Outings Lane. Turn right then into Church Lane towards the church. There was Doddinghurst Hall, number 3, where the pub now is, and Hall Farm with its barns and outbuildings, most of which were demolished in 1959. This was then the manor of Doddinghurst. Then, of course, the church, number 4, Grade 1 listed and dating from the 13th century, and our little priest house, built in 1485. There were no other buildings round here then, just farmland, and it's highly likely that where most of you live now was just a field then. So let's go back and turn down Doddinghurst Road, past the old Georgian rectory, also demolished in 1959, where Baker's Meadow now is, past Pear Tree Farm, number 6, and Pear Tree Cottage, number 7. Then down to what is now Mount Nessing Lane, into an area which was then known as Eaton Street, past Pettit's Farm, number 8, Shops Farm, number 9, Emblems Farm, number 10, and then up to the right, past what were Kemp's Cottages, number 11, to Swallow's Cross Farm, number 12. There was, according to the later Victorian censuses, a Boozy's Farm up this road somewhere, but I haven't been able to identify where it was or who lived there and why it came to be called Boozy's Farm. At this point, let's retrace our steps and go down the twisty road to Brentwood that we all know so well. And on the far right, set back from the road, beyond Parkwood, there was Park Farm, number 13, and on the left, Bannister's Farm, number 14, and America Farm, 15. Further on, there were Gray's Cottages, 16, a cluster of buildings around the Blue House, number 17, and a collection of smaller farms that were set back from the road, Cumbers, Abbery's, and Sumner's Farm, all marked as 18 because they were just a cluster, and Howe Farm, number 19. And just over the boundary into Shenfield Parish, Brickhouse Farm, 20. Why I have included Brickhouse Farm will become clear later. Further west, there's Wishfield's Farm, number 21, and Plonker's Green. Sorry, I mustn't giggle. Number 21, with 2 isolated cottages, number 22. These dwellings almost formed a little hamlet in its own right. South of these was Salmon's Farm, also known as Days. Coming round northwest from Days Farm, along Frog Street and Warren Lane, towards Kelton Hatch, there were more farms and cottages. Cow Farm, 24, Clay Pit Cottages, 25, Covers Farm, 26, also known as Myers, Cows Farm, 27, and Red House Farm, 28. Dagwood Farm was built later in Dagwood. At the junction of Warren Lane, Stocks Lane, and Church Lane, there is the house called Three Once, number 29, and opposite were cottages called Atkins Cottages, number 31, and they're no longer there. Then going right or east, past some cottages known as Home Pit, Dormans or Furs Cottages, and Manor Cottage, 30, and up Place Farm, past Place Farm, also then known as Spriggs. On the right is the site of Kensington's or Doddinghurst Place, the manor house in which Richard Stoneleigh lived, which was demolished probably about the early 19th century, leaving Place Farm Cottages, number 33. At the top of Place Farm Lane, on the other side of the road, where School Lane comes out, there were a cluster of cottages which are no longer there, called Rupels and Eves, and Rupels was the blacksmiths. If you turn back then towards southwest, back towards Foxhatch, there were quite a few buildings surrounding Glover's Farm, which is now demolished, and the two inns, the Swan Inn, now the Indian restaurant, and the Shepherd. Round this area there were many smaller dwellings, housing the majority of the population at that time. And it's about that little community I'll be talking next time. So if we go on towards the A128, what is now the A128, the main road between Brentwood and Ongar, at its junction with Blackmore Road, there is a bridle way to the left, so you'll probably be aware of that. This formed the parish boundary and was at the north end of what was called Doddinghurst Common. On this land was the Doddinghurst Parish Poorhouse, number 37, which was demolished in the 1870s. So now we know the extent of the parish and the main buildings, but what about the people there? Who were they and what did they do? In 1841, the population totaled 419. Now, it was 2,832 in 2011, and Kelvedon Hatch was in 2011, 2,541. So you see that the moving the boundaries resulted in a more equal population between the parishes. The 419 didn't vary significantly in the censuses up to 1901, when it dipped to 371, as fewer farm workers were needed due to the mechanization of agricultural machinery. In every census, there were more males than females, because quite a few single men were employed on the land. Some surnames predominated, as families tended to stay in the same villages year on year, and there were many children. For example, in 1841, nearly half the population of the parish had one of the following 10 surnames: Cole, Hammond, Wheel, Harvey, Rainbird, Littlechild, Sawkins, Lagden, Porter, and Bloomfield. We will hear more about some of these people, many of whom are buried in this churchyard. With regard to Christian names, I was intrigued to see that in 1841, out of 229 males, there were 39 Williams, 19 Thomases, and 13 Henrys. Okay. No Allens or Liams or Ryans or Tylers. And out of 190 females, there were 30 Sarahs, 14 Annes, and 14 Susannas. And in 1851, when middle names were also recorded, there were 28 Mary Anns. No Mears, Stacys, Claires, Junes, or anything like that. But strangely, there were no Victorias in any of the Victorian census records from Doddinghurst. There were quite a few other names from the Bible: Elijah, Joshua, Abraham, Isaac, Solomon, Jesse, Ezekiel, Joseph, Ruth, Esther, Martha, and in 1851 there was a Shadrach who lived at Rupels, the blacksmith. There's the census return, and you can see at the bottom there's Shadrach, amongst, I think they must have run out of names. There we go. But I think that caught my eye. One point that amused me, amongst many, was that the enumerator, the local man who wrote down the names visiting each household, occasionally had a problem with the spelling of unfamiliar names. This is how he wrote Louisa in 1871. Louisa a newborn baby girl living at the Blue House, number 17 on your map, to Charles Gray, an agricultural labourer, and his wife Mary. It took me a while to work out Louisa until I said it out loud to myself. But he said it out loud, okay. A George Gray, who may have been his brother, lived nearby at Sumner's, number 18 on your map, and he and his wife, another Mary, had a little daughter of 2, whose name is recorded as Mehelea. I thought, Mehelea, but it's I still don't know how you pronounce it, Mahala? And there she is, little Mahala, or Mehelea, 2 years old. There were some other unusual names. Bramston Baker, tenant farmer of Doddinghurst Hall Farm. Bridges Harvey, the rector, whose name is often cited wrongly as Harvey Bridges, and understandably so. Worsley Moyer at Converse Farm, and another Mahala, Bannister at Park Wood. Where do Bramston, Bridges, Worsley and Mahala come from? There were, of course, large families, many of which had more than 5 children. The most I could find in one family was 11 children. In 1851, William Porter was a woodcutter who lived at the Three Once with another large family, the Baines. William was 54, and his wife, Sarah, surprise, surprise with the names, William and Sarah, was 40, and they had 9 sons and 2 daughters. The 5 eldest, whose ages ranged from 19 to 14, were also woodcutters. The youngest child was just 2. There may well have been more children to come, but this branch of the Porter family appears to have moved away before the 1861 census. I also noticed another family, the Reeds of Swallows Cross Farm, number 12 on your map, who in 1851 had 6 daughters and no sons. So no younger generation to help on their farm. And at 51, Mary Reed was not going to produce a much longed-for son. They must have despaired. Enough figures and statistics, well, nearly, though I can't help but being fascinated by such information. What was life like in the early Victorian period for those who lived and worked in this parish? Just one more illuminating statistic is that out of 419 people, 253 lived in the Kelvedon Common Foxhatch area, the one no longer in our parish. The other 166 lived on the many farms and farm cottages scattered around on our map, working on the land from a very early age until they died. There was no pensionable retirement age then, and the Education Act that ensured children went to school until they were 13 was not passed until 1870. And even then, most rural areas didn't enforce it strictly, especially during the busy seasons on the farm. There are numerous examples in the censuses of both very young and very old people being recorded as agricultural labourers. Here are one or two. William Fitch, aged 8, working on Glover's Farm, number 35. Another 8-year-old, William Rainbird, working on Cow Farm. And there are many more, some listed as cowboys or shepherds or errand boys. The girls went into service as young as 12 on a nearby farm or one of the big houses. The younger ones, no doubt, helping their mothers at home from an early age. As for the older people, there were many agricultural labourers over 60. In 1851, Joseph Wheel was still working at Wishfield's farm at the age of 78. William Adams at Glover's Farm at the age of 88. And even more incredibly, in 1891, a William Greenhill is recorded as an agricultural worker at Swallows Cross Farm at the age of 94. At first I thought that was a transcription error. Well, you would, wouldn't you? But I checked it out against other records, and it was accurate. His wife, Sarah, was 90. And we complain that the pensionable age is now 67. If these old men didn't work, they didn't get paid and would be sent to the poorhouse if their families couldn't support them. So what did the very young and the very old do to earn their meagre wages? William Howard, a Victorian writer, described the jobs a village boy as young as 6 might do. Guard the gates to stop the cattle from straying, scare away the birds, gather potatoes, sow seeds, pick hops and apples, gather mushrooms and blackberries, herd flocks of geese or turkeys, drive sheep to market, lift and carry things round the farmyard, shred turnips or beetroot, hold sacks open for filling, bring in the firewood. I expect the elderly helped the children in these tasks and gave valuable advice and encouragement. The class structure was very rigid. Some of those recorded on the census owned their properties or the land. However, much of the land round here that had belonged to the Luther, Glascock and Daughtry families in the 18th century was inherited through marriage and subsequently owned by the Fane family, who had estates all over Essex and elsewhere. The rector who succeeded Bridges Harvey in 1848 had also acquired land here. His name was William Manby, and he is recorded in Kelly's directories of 1855 and 1878 as the principal landowner in Doddinghurst, along with Colonel Fane, a descendant of Richard Stoneleigh. How William Manby became a landowner in Doddinghurst is an interesting little story in itself. His father was a sailmaker, and he was originally William Tidy. He changed his name by deed poll, as that was a condition of his inheriting property from his cousin, yet another William Manby. The Manbys owned swathes of land across Essex in the early 19th century, including Doddinghurst Hall and, of course, the old rectory. William Manby is buried in a prominent position on the left of the church path. There it is. You can see it as you go out. That tombstone, that grave is his. Fane and Manby leased their farms and surrounding fields to copyhold tenants who were their own bosses, but they had to pay a certain amount of their profits to the landowners. Some bought the freehold as they gained more wealth, for example, the Lagdons. These freehold and copyhold farmers generally prospered and became, to some extent, and depending upon the size of their farms, the local gentry. In some of the censuses, the acreage of each farm is recorded. Doddinghurst Hall Farm had 160 acres and was managed in 1841 by Bramston Baker and later by his son-in-law, Ezekiel Dove. Their graves are just outside to the right of the church path as you go out. Cow Farm, owned in 1861 by the Lagdons, had 150 acres. There are 17 members of the Lagdon family buried here, all within a few yards of the church. There were also those who managed to buy small holdings, which were often called after them, for example, Atkins cottages, Kemp's cottages, and Eves cottages. Employees, the agricultural labourers, were paid very little, just enough to survive, and lived in cold, cramped conditions. The cottages on Mill Lane in Kelton Hatch is one of the few remaining examples of what these buildings were like. Terraced rows of low stone-built dwellings. For an example of just how cramped they could be, in 1891, Robert Everett, an agricultural worker aged 38, lived with his wife and 9 children in one of the place farm cottages with only 4 small rooms. None of the farm workers' cottages are listed as having more than 4 rooms. Some only had 3 or even 2. It's interesting to note that the tenant farmers' wives had a recognised occupation, farmer's wife, but the workers didn't. And a farmer's widow was acknowledged as such, as a farmer's widow, whereas a worker's widow was termed a pauper. So there were landowners, freehold and tenant farmers, labourers, and then the lowest of the low, the paupers. In 1851, there were 3 families living in the poorhouse, which was a row of terrace cottages on Doddinghurst Common. One of the families was headed by Deborah Hammond, a widow of 49, who was supporting 5 children. Her eldest was a boy of 16 who was an agricultural worker, and his meagre wages would have paid the token rent which kept them out of the workhouse in Ongar. Other paupers received charitable support from the church in a variety of ways. One elderly couple, James and Elizabeth Adams, aged 75 and 70, were housed in Priest House, along with an elderly widow, Elizabeth Davy, also aged 70. Some of the rents due to the rector from his properties went into funds out of which money, coals and bread were distributed to those in need. Other landowners had left capital sums, specifying that the interest was to be used to help the poor. For example, Glascock's charity, Daughtry's charity, and Luther's money, which were administered by the church wardens. These were very harsh times, as is illustrated by the following stories from local newspapers. The Essex Standard of January the 3rd, 1840, ran a report describing how an agricultural labourer, William Stern, aged 31, who lived on Kelvedon Common, stole a piece of elm wood from the premises of Samuel Randall, who was at that time the tenant farmer at Cow Farm. An employee of Randall's had been about to cart a load of barley to Hornchurch at 2:30 a.m. on December the 9th, 1839. Imagine how hard that would have been on a cold winter's night. Before leaving, he saw Stern with the piece of wood over his shoulder, and as it was a starlit night, he recognized him. Stern was convicted of the theft of that piece of wood and sentenced to 3 months' imprisonment and hard labour, the last 2 weeks in solitary confinement. This is a very sad story. I don't know whether Stern died in prison, but he was dead a year later, as the 1841 census records his wife as a widow and a pauper, still living in Kelvedon Common, aged 30, with 5 children, aged 10, 8, 7, 4, and 2. In the same newspaper, I was shocked to read that a bricklayer who had stolen a live, tame duck, it sounds funny, but he was sentenced to 10 years transportation. I know. 18 years later, in 1858, the same harsh sentences were being handed out. In the Chelmsford Chronicle of January the 8th, it was reported that Thomas Whiffin, late of Doddinghurst, had stolen 2 asses, worth 20 shillings and 25 shillings, from Francis Crabb and Thomas Wheel, who were both agricultural workers near Wishfield's farm, living on those isolated cottages which are 22 on your plan. Whiffin had sold the animals for a sovereign, saying he had bought them in Romford. After a guilty verdict, he was sentenced to 4 years penal servitude. Sad times. So it's now time to tell you a dramatic story about something that happened in Doddinghurst in 1836, just before Victoria came to the throne, so I thought I could sneak it in. This event was recorded at length in many newspapers throughout the country. It concerned His Serene Highness, the Duke Charles of Brunswick, and a Mrs. Graham, who lived in London. Margaret Graham and her husband George were well-known English balloonists of the mid-19th century. They made many ascents between 1820s and from the 1820s to the 1850s endangering their lives on many occasions. In 1836, Mrs. Graham was 32 and she had 7 children. The Northampton Mercury of August the 7th, 1836, had this headline to an article that ran to several columns, some of which I will summarize and some quote in full. So I'm quote, "Balloon ascent of the Duke of Brunswick and Mrs. Graham. Melancholy accident. On Monday afternoon, His Serene Highness, the Duke of Brunswick, accompanied Mrs. Graham in her 15th ascent with her splendid new balloon. At 1:30, His Serene Highness arrived at the Flora Gardens, Bayswater, accompanied by several gentlemen of his suite. 4 of his servants in livery carried an extremely large cloak, a telescope, a scarlet flag, and a large umbrella. At 3 o'clock, the balloon car, which was a new one, built of cane and lined with yellow silk, was attached to the netting, and at 3:30, the neck of the balloon was detached from the gas pipe, and the stupendous machine was floated to the centre of the gardens, and the car fastened to the top of a large table, round which the company had arranged themselves. Mrs. Graham stepped into the car, followed by His Serene Highness, who at first exhibited slight symptoms of trepidation. But in a few seconds he recovered his self-possession. The ballast was removed, and the balloon rose majestically and proceeded steadily in a northeasterly direction. After a pleasant trip of about 2 hours, the balloon was over some fields adjoining Kelvedon Wood, about 4 miles from Brentwood in Essex, and thinking it a convenient place to descend, Mrs. Graham made preparations to do so. But from some unfortunate accident, the car was turned on one side, and both aeronauts were thrown to the ground. Mrs. Graham from a height of nearly 30 feet, and the Duke just as the car was nearly touching the ground. That's the quotation. I'm summarizing the rest. I think you can understand why. They had fallen into a field near Converse Farm, covers there, which is number 26 on your map. Mr. George Moyer, who was the tenant farmer, rushed to their aid and carried Mrs. Graham into the farmhouse. The Duke, who was not seriously injured, described the incident in a letter printed in full in the newspaper. He described how Mrs. Graham was rendered unconscious and how he immediately sent for medical aid and for Mr. Graham, who rode out straight away from their home in Poland Street in London. Mr. Moyer sent for the rector, the Reverend Bridges Harvey, who spent the night at Converse Farm, as did Mrs. Harvey. Mr. Graham returned to London on the Tuesday, leaving his wife in the care of the Moyers at Converse Farm. Unfortunately, despite having regained consciousness, her condition worsened, and Mr. Moyer rode into London himself to fetch back Mr. Graham. The following day, it was sadly recorded that she was delivered of a stillborn male child. To quote from the Globe of August the 26th, 1836, Mrs. Graham sustained herself with great fortitude, and the clergyman of Doddinghurst pays her the most benevolent and religious attention, whilst numerous persons, many of distinction, have proceeded from London to make anxious inquiries after her. Mrs. Graham remained at Converse Farm for 5 weeks, and though her injuries were severe, she did make a full recovery and made many more balloon ascents, including one in 1838 at the coronation of Queen Victoria. The incident must have created much excitement in Doddinghurst, an out-of-the-way place where nothing much happened, and unused to visits from persons of distinction. Nevertheless, it must have been challenging for the Moir family, who had young children and the usual harvesting to do in August and early September. Indeed, George Moir wrote to the London Times in October to express his view on what had happened. I'm quoting, "I was the only person with a distinct and clear sight of the Duke's fall, and immediately after his coming to my house, I requested him to take some refreshment and offered with my own hands a glass of brandy and water, thinking that that would do him more good than doctor's stuff or bleeding, which he politely refused. So I drank it myself to his good health. Good for him." He then goes on to say that he sent 2 horses for medical assistance, and I think they must have had riders as well, and confirmed other details of the incident, and finally concluded, "Mr. Graham assured us that the Duke of Brunswick would pay for every expense attending this accident, and at the same time requesting that nothing might be wanting for Mrs. Graham's comfort. Mr. Graham also assured me of his intention to cover all the costs, and he did this in the presence of the lady of the Reverend Bridges Harvey, who had been very kind in sitting up all night with Mrs. Graham. How far such promise has been fulfilled, I leave the public to judge. Mrs. Graham remained at my house upwards of 5 weeks, and the expenses attending the same, along with the medical gentleman's bills and attendance, have not been paid. Mrs. Graham left my house on the 25th of September in a post-chaise for Brentwood. On her departure, she did not even return common thanks for the trouble and inconvenience she put us to, let alone the attention she was shown for her comfort during her long stay. So much for balloon gratitude. And the Moyers are buried, for those sitting at the back, you're within a yard or 2 of the Moyers' grave, which is just outside the back window there. Oh dear, what a fascinating story, unfolding just over a mile away from here. And there's another story that was reported at length throughout the country, that of the murder of Jael Denny in 1851. It became widely known as the Doddinghurst murder. So from the Essex Standard, 18th of October 1850, slightly abbreviated. You'll be glad to hear. The village of Doddinghurst, and indeed the whole of that part of the country, has been thrown into the most painful excitement by the discovery of a murder, attended by circumstances of a somewhat extraordinary character. The victim was a single woman by the name of Jael Denny, who lived with her mother and stepfather at a cottage on a small farmhouse named Cumber's Farm, number 18 on your maps, in the parish of Doddinghurst. And the supposed murderer is Thomas Drury, a young man of 23 who was managing his father's farm, Brick House Farm, which was number 20, just over the parish border. Jael Denny, Jael Denny's stepfather, Thomas Last, aged nearly 70, had been employed as a looker at the farm until Michaelmas last, and there commenced a criminal intimacy between Drury and his stepdaughter, aged 20. It appears the young woman was very near her confinement, and Drury, who was on the eve of marriage to someone else, had endeavoured to shake off the imputation of being the father of her expected offspring, but still the intimacy continued. At 6:30 last Saturday, Jael told her mother, Louisa Last, that she was going to meet Drury. She did not return, and after passing a night of agonizing anxiety, her stepfather at an early hour the next morning started out in search of her. After a long time in the course of exploring a brook, fearing she may have drowned, he was returning home when in a nook at the bottom of a meadow, about a field from his own house, he found the lifeless body of his stepdaughter with a cord drawn so tightly round her neck as to cut into her flesh, and the end held loosely in her left hand, apparently to suggest the idea of suicide. There was, of course, an inquest to which many witnesses were called, and all their testimonies were reported in full in the press. It emerged that Drury had tried to get Jael Denny to write a letter which he would show to his intended, a Miss Giblin, a farmer's daughter, much more appropriate as a wife than a farm worker's stepdaughter, saying he was not the father of the expected baby. He had also told Louisa Last, Jael's mother, that he thought Jael had stolen one of his razors, apparently with a view to killing herself. The newspaper article contained many gory details. I shan't repeat them here. This isn't another episode of Gunpowder, except for one at the end, which seems to equate with people these days taking selfies at crime scenes. It was reported some persons fond of treasuring the horrible, it was found on Sunday, had cut up and carried away the turf upon which the death struggle took place, and which was stained with the unfortunate woman's blood. The funeral in this church, which is recorded in the burial register as October the 19th, 1850, is described in melancholy detail in the Chelmsford Chronicle of the 25th of October, 1850. I quote, "The funeral of Jael Denny, the victim in the tragedy of Doddinghurst, took place on Saturday afternoon in the churchyard of the village, about 2 miles from the cottage where the deceased parents reside. The ceremony was conducted in the most private manner possible. At about 3 o'clock, a one-horse hearse of the most common description received the pauper coffin and moved off towards Doddinghurst, followed by the aged mother and father, a sister of the deceased, and 2 or 3 neighbours. As the mourners walked, the funeral carriage was compelled to proceed at a very slow pace, and it was 4 o'clock before it reached the church. Here, a small knot of villagers had assembled to witness the ceremony, but there was no indication of vulgar curiosity on the part of any of the persons present. On the contrary, all the spectators appeared painfully impressed by the melancholy occasion. The coffin was conveyed into the church, preceded by the vicar, the Reverend William Manby, reading a portion of the funeral service. The coffin was placed on the trestles in the centre aisle, and the usual prayers were read over the body, after which the procession returned into the churchyard, in a retired corner of which the coffin was lowered into a grave about 5 feet deep. We don't know where that was. The bystanders were most painfully affected, and the scene altogether was of a very melancholy character. By this time, Thomas Jury was in Chelmsford Jail, having been escorted there by train. His trial took place 6 months later and was widely reported in the press. There are over 100 articles relating to it in the press archive. Reports of crimes and trials seemed to be in much greater detail in those days, running to many column inches and including every tiny details of what happened and who said what. Here's just a tiny proportion of what was written in the Chelmsford Chronicle of March the 14th, 1851. The nature of the crime and the mystery, partaking of the fearfully romantic which hung about this case, gave it an interest and produced an excitement unparalleled in the criminal annals of the country. The article goes on to describe the huge crowds who came to the courts, jostling the judge and members of the jury on their arrival. They had to be restrained to let the officials through. Thomas Drury pleaded not guilty. The article continues. He is described as 23 years old, and his look has a still more youthful appearance. Though small in stature, his frame is strongly knit, and his face bears a character of mildness rather than the lines of those ferocious feelings and determined passions that the fancy looks for in the countenance of the perpetrator of so fearful a crime. He was dressed in a black frock coat, a black satin waistcoat, and kerseymere trousers, whatever that is. The court heard all the evidence from a considerable number of witnesses, with the inevitable verdict being a guilty one. Thomas Drury was sentenced to death by hanging. The sentence was carried out a fortnight later. The Essex Standard of March the 28th, 1851, describes the enormous crowd who came to Chelmsford to watch, including many from Doddinghurst. I quote, "It was thought that there could not have been less than about 10 to 15,000 persons present. There was from Doddinghurst and the villages around the scene of the murder of Gerald Denny, an immense concourse of people who had travelled to Chelmsford in every available conveyance. Not a few walked 12 to 15 miles to witness the death of one who, previous to the commission of this enormous offence, had generally been esteemed as a respectable and kind young man. Drury had confessed to the murder and to being the father of Jael's child in the fortnight between the verdict and his execution. He was buried in the prison grounds. What a tragic story, and what a sad way for Doddinghurst to become the focal point of the nation's interest in the middle of the 19th century. So, thank you for coming today, and thank you to Bill for the PowerPoint and for navigating the maps so effectively. I hope you'll come to the next talk in the spring, which will include more stories about the wonderful parish of Doddinghurst, including a detailed look at how the school was begun, and also about Foxhatch. So thank you, and we're going to now draw the raffle. I'll have a grab. Thank you.